Okay, so if you're the kind of person who loves to really dig into the big questions, the deep stuff about the mind and reality, and, those fundamental questions about value, then today's deep dive is going to be right up your alley. We're going to be exploring the work of Johann Friedrich Herbart, a guy who lived from 1776 to 1841. And he's often called, one of the founders of modern psychology and also a big name in educational theory. But what we're going to try to do today is go a little beyond that, go beyond just the psych and the educational stuff, and really look at his whole philosophical project, which is, well, it's pretty impressive, and I think you'll find some surprises in there.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. I mean, when we talk about Herbart, we usually focus on, like you said, the psychology of the education, but he was at heart a philosopher. And I think if we really want to understand his ideas, we have to approach them from that angle. That's kind of our mission today, to kind of excavate the philosophical core of Herbart's thinking.
Exactly. And the source material that we're going to be using for this deep dive is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on Herbart. It's a really comprehensive overview of his work, and it does a great job of placing him within the broader context of philosophical history. So, a little bit of background on Herbart. He was, as we said, a philosopher, but he was also a psychologist and an educational theorist. And it's actually interesting that, back in his own time, he was mainly seen as a philosopher. His contemporaries really saw him as a major figure in philosophy. But for various reasons, his direct influence on kind of mainstream academic philosophy, at least in the immediate aftermath of his life, it wasn't as pronounced as you might expect. However, and this is the really fascinating part, certain key elements of his thought proved to be incredibly fruitful.
Yeah, and they ended up influencing a whole range of later thinkers, sometimes in ways that maybe even they weren't fully aware of. You see traces of Herbart in folks like Fechner, Helmholtz, Natorp, Wundt, even Freud, Brentano, and Husserl.
That's a pretty diverse group.
It is. I mean, that just goes to show how wide-ranging his impact really was. And even today, there's a renewed interest in Herbart's work, particularly his ideas about what he called psychomechanics, which is essentially his attempt to apply mathematical principles to the study of the mind.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this whole system. Where should we begin?
Well, I think the best place to start is with his logic and metaphysics, specifically his method of relations.
All right, method of relations. What's that all about?
Well, it's essentially Herbart's main, I guess you could call it, a logical innovation, and it served as the foundation for his entire philosophical approach. It was his way of ensuring, correct, rigorous metaphysical thinking. He was really concerned with certain philosophical problems that he saw as constantly popping up and creating these contradictions. And the contradictions would appear even though they seem to be rooted in our actual experience.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Like, how can a single thing, one substance, have so many different characteristics? What is the nature of causality? How do we even conceive of matter? And perhaps the most perplexing one, the ego, the self. These concepts seem to come directly from experience, but when you start analyzing them closely, they seem to lead to these dead ends.
Right, because how can one thing, this thing, have so many and sometimes even completely opposite properties? And the ego, right, that feels like this unified me, but it's also this constantly changing stream of thoughts, feelings, perceptions. It's like the classic philosophical problem of the one and the many all over again.
Exactly. And Herbart's method of relations is his attempt to address these sorts of problems head on. So instead of thinking of these seemingly contradictory elements as distinct entities locked in some kind of battle, he says, no. Think of them as members of a unifying relation.
Interesting. So instead of saying, okay, here's the thing and here are all its qualities separate from the thing, you're saying the thing is the interconnectedness of those qualities.
Exactly. He's saying the thing isn't a substance plus qualities. The thing is the whole web, the network of those qualities.
That's a very different way of looking at it, a relational view of substance, which is, for philosophers, it's a pretty significant departure from more traditional ways of thinking about substance. So how does this apply to the ego? Because that's a real head scratcher.
Right. Well, he says the psyche, the mind, it's not some kind of fixed container that holds our thoughts and feelings. He defines it more functionally as the condition of mental change itself. It's representing the activity of the mind, not a thing in itself.
And this seems to connect to, Kant's philosophy, right? That distinction between the phenomenal world, the world of experience, and the noumenal world, the world of things in themselves that we can't directly access.
Yeah, he definitely draws on Kant here. That idea that there's something beyond our immediate experience, something that grounds the coherence of our perceptions. And Herbart calls these noumena, these things in themselves, speculative entities. But for him, they're not objects of intuition like they might be for other philosophers. They're the conditions that make experience possible, the transcendental conditions for unified experience.
But Herbart doesn't stop there, does he? He adds his own unique concept, this act of self-preservation that he attributes to every existent.
Right, and this is where things get really interesting and maybe a little tricky to wrap your head around. But this concept is super important for Herbart. It's at the heart of both his psychology and his metaphysics. He says every single thing that exists, every noumenon, has this inherent act of self-preservation, this kind of fundamental striving to maintain its own being, its own identity.
So every element of reality has this drive, this kind of ontological inertia to just keep being what it is.
In a way, yeah. And without that inherent force, he's saying there's no real reason to think it would continue to exist at all. So it's like this basic ontological principle of persistence.
So if I'm trying to get this straight, Herbart's method of relations, it's trying to bridge this gap between the crazy multiplicity of our senses, all those perceptions, and the intelligible, unified concepts we use to try to make sense of it all. And these speculative unities are the metaphysical side of things, the things in themselves that we can't directly know, but that sort of explain why we can have coherent experiences at all.
Exactly. It's not about just identifying contradictions. It's about resolving them by figuring out the underlying relational structures that explain why things appear the way they do.
So it's not just logic chopping, it's actually trying to find a deeper kind of explanatory structure for reality itself.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's the logic and metaphysics. Now, how does this all connect to his psychology? Because that's where he's probably best known, right? The whole science of representations thing.
Right. And the big question for Herbart's psychology is how can the ego, the self, arise as one unified thing out of this whole mess of interconnected, often conflating mental states, which he calls representations.
Right, because on the one hand, we have this feeling of a unified self, a single I experiencing the world. But then when you look inside, it's just this crazy jumble of thoughts, feelings, perceptions, memories. How does that all come together?
Exactly. And right off the bat, this puts Herbart in opposition to what was, at the time, a very popular theory of the mind called faculty psychology.
Right. Faculty psychology, like the mind is divided into these separate innate powers or faculties, things like memory, understanding, will. And Kant was a big proponent of that, right?
It was. But Herbart had some serious issues with faculty psychology. For one thing, he argued that these faculties are really just names, just convenient labels we slap onto certain mental activities.
Like instead of actually explaining how memory works, you just say, oh, that's the memory faculty doing its thing.
Exactly. It doesn't explain anything. It just gives it a name.
So it's like saying, oh, digestion happens because of the digestion faculty. It's descriptive, but it's not really explanatory.
Right. And he also questioned how these supposedly separate faculties were supposed to interact with each other. If they're truly independent powers, how do they work together to produce unified thought and action?
It would be like a bunch of little dictators all trying to run the mind at the same time.
Yeah, kind of mental anarchy. And he also thought that faculty psychology led to a very fragmented view of the self, as if we're just this collection of disconnected mental modules.
Yeah.
But maybe his most important critique, especially given his desire to make psychology a rigorous science, is that faculty theory was just too vague. It didn't provide the kind of precise, quantifiable descriptions that a real science needs to operate with. It lacked the exactness needed for formulating testable laws, for making predictions.
Okay, so Herbart wanted to create a new kind of psychology, a scientific psychology modeled on, the successful natural sciences like physics. What were the main principles of this new science of the mind?
Well, the core assumption is that all mental phenomena, all the stuff that goes on in our minds, is governed by laws, just like the physical world is governed by laws of nature. And these laws, he believed, could be discovered through careful observation, logical deduction, the formation and testing of hypotheses, and really importantly, through the use of measurement and mathematical calculation whenever possible.
So a more quantifiable, precise approach.
Exactly.
Now, this commitment to a scientific method, it raises the question of how we actually study the mind. And introspection seems like the most obvious, the most direct way, right? Just look inward and see what's going on.
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But Herbart, even though he was so focused on the inner workings of the mind, was actually quite skeptical of introspection as a primary method for discovering the fundamental laws of psychology.
Really? Why is that?
Well, he argued that the very act of deliberately observing your own mental processes actually interferes with those processes, changes them.
Like the observer effect in physics.
Exactly. Even the most passive kind of introspection, he argued, is problematic because we inevitably bring our pre-existing biases, our expectations, our beliefs about ourselves to the table. And that can distort what we observe and how we interpret it.
So what about looking at, the output of the mind? The things we create, the behaviors we exhibit.
He saw limitations there too, because those things, the products of the mind, they're already once removed from the underlying psychological processes. And then there's the issue of relying on the reports of others. But that ultimately comes back to their introspection, which might be unreliable, and then you add another layer of interpretation, which is also influenced by the observer's own subjectivity.
So it seems like Herbart thought we needed something more than just direct observation.
Right. He argued that empirical psychology, while important, is constantly dealing with a very fragmented, shifting stream of data. We need a framework, a structure, to make sense of it all. And that's where his method of relations, his metaphysics, comes in.
Okay, so metaphysics isn't just some abstract philosophical exercise for Herbart. It's the foundation for a truly scientific psychology.
Exactly. Because it provides the principles, the concepts that allow us to connect those isolated observations, to see the underlying unity behind the multiplicity of experience. And this is where the mathematical aspect comes in as well. He was convinced that math was the key to unlocking the fundamental laws of the mind.
So not just qualitative descriptions, but quantifiable, measurable models.
Precisely. But he was careful to say that this wasn't about just blindly applying math to raw experience. It's about applying it to experience that has already been, you could say, processed through metaphysics. Metaphysics provides the conceptual framework, and then math allows us to make those concepts precise and to trace their interconnections.
Okay, so we have this framework, this methodology in place. And now let's dive into the actual content of his psychology, starting with his concept of representations, these fundamental building blocks of mental life.
So for Herbart, the mind is essentially a continuous flow of these representations. And in a very Herbartian move, he calls them the self-preservations of the soul.
Which links back to his metaphysical idea of self-preservation, right?
Exactly. The soul, he argues, is fundamentally simple. It's a unity. It resists any kind of differentiation or disturbance. So the fact that we experience all these different thoughts, feelings, perceptions, it presents a kind of paradox.
Because where's all this diversity coming from if the soul is so simple and unified?
Right. And his answer is it's coming from the external world, from the objects that impinge upon us through our senses. So the soul is this receptive ground, this unity, and the external world is constantly acting upon it, creating these disturbances, these differentiations, which manifest as individual representations.
So the world pokes at the soul, and the soul reacts by creating these representations.
You could say that, yeah. And the soul also tries to resist these disturbances to maintain its unity. So there's this kind of fundamental tension between the differentiating force of the world and the unifying force of the soul.
Okay, so psychology, for Herbart, becomes the study of how all these different representations interact with each other, how they try to resolve themselves and achieve a state of unity within the soul.
Exactly. And he identifies two main ways that representations interact. They can either merge or inhibit each other. If they're similar, they tend to merge, to kind of blend together.
Like two drops of water merging into a larger drop.
Yeah, good analogy. But if they're different, or especially if they're opposed in some way, they inhibit each other. They struggle for dominance in consciousness. He even compares it to ripples on a pond, how they can either reinforce or cancel each other out.
It's a very dynamic picture, the mind as this constant interplay of forces.
It is. And he talks about representations having a kind of force, or striving, which ties back to that fundamental principle of self-preservation.
So representations aren't just these passive images floating around. They're actively trying to persist, to become clear in consciousness. And when they're held back, they become these strivings.
Exactly. And he explains a lot of our mental phenomena, like memories fading and returning, in terms of this dynamic interplay of representations.
Yeah.
But as we said before, just observing this interplay isn't enough. We need a more systematic way to understand the laws that govern it. And that's where the math comes in. The degree to which representations oppose each other, their initial intensity, how bright they are in consciousness, all these factors determine how much they inhibit each other, how strong their strivings become. This is the basis for his attempt to create a quantitative psychology.
Okay, now we're getting into some more technical terms here, like statics of spirit and inhibition sum. What's all that about?
So psychostatics is Herbart's term for the study of, the final state of equilibrium that's reached after the initial interactions between representations. Think of it like a snapshot, a frozen picture of the mind after those representations have settled down. And the inhibition sum is the total amount of opposing force that exists between two or more representations when they've reached that equilibrium point.
So, if I'm understanding this right, when a new representation enters consciousness, it's going to kind of shake things up, bump into other representations, and eventually they're all going to kind of settle into a new configuration, a new balance point.
Exactly. It's like, if you drop a bunch of marbles into a bowl, they're going to bounce around and eventually come to rest in a certain pattern. And the inhibition sum is like a measure of the total tension, the total force that's still present between those marbles, even though they're not moving anymore.
And he also talks about the inhibition ratio, right? Which
Yeah.
is how that total inhibitory force is distributed between the different representations.
Right. And the idea is that stronger, more intense representations are better at resisting inhibition. They have more vivacity, as he calls it, and they can hold their ground against those weaker representations that are trying to push them out of consciousness.
And he actually developed mathematical formulas to calculate these things, the inhibition sum, the inhibition ratio. It's pretty impressive, this attempt to quantify these subtle mental processes. And all this leads him to the concept of the limen, or the threshold of consciousness, which, as we mentioned earlier, had a huge influence on later thinkers like Freud. How does that come about?
Well, when he was working with his mathematical models, especially when he was dealing with three or more representations interacting, he noticed something interesting. Sometimes his calculations would result in a representation having zero or even a negative value for its remaining vivacity after all the inhibition had taken place.
A negative representation? What does that even mean?
Right, it doesn't really make intuitive sense. So Herbart interpreted this as meaning that the representation had been completely pushed out of consciousness. It was no longer present in awareness. But it wasn't destroyed. It was just below the threshold of awareness, still active in some sense, but not consciously experienced. And this threshold is what he called the limen.
So it's like a dividing line between the conscious and the unconscious.
Exactly. And he even came up with a specific formula, the Schwellen formel, to calculate this static threshold. And one of the implications of this is that at any given moment, our conscious awareness is only a tiny fraction of all the stuff that's going on in our minds.
Right, because all those other representations, all those thoughts, feelings, memories, they're not just gone, they're just below the surface, below the limen, still active, still influencing us in ways that we might not even be aware of.
Exactly. And this helps to explain things like forgotten memories suddenly resurfacing, or the influence of unconscious biases on our behavior.
It's a very powerful concept, and it really anticipates a lot of later developments in psychology. And he also makes the point that a single representation might not be strong enough to push another one completely out of consciousness, but if you have two or more stronger representations ganging up on a weaker one, then that weaker one can be driven below the limen. He also defines consciousness itself as the totality of all the representations that are present at a given moment, and our state of mind as the particular arrangement of those representations. But what's interesting is that he argues that the limited capacity of our consciousness, the fact that we can only focus on a few things at once, it's not necessarily because the mind itself is limited. It's because of the constant competition, the inhibition between all these representations that are vying for a spot in the limelight of consciousness.
Now, beyond this whole inhibition thing, he also talks about how representations can actually unite through what he calls fusions and complications.
Okay, so now we're moving from competition to cooperation.
In a way, yeah. And the key distinction here is whether the representations belong to the same basic kind of experience or not. For example, different colors are all part of the same continuum of visual experience, but a color and a sound are from totally different continua.
So the rules of the game are different depending on whether the representations are playing on the same field or not.
That's a good way to put it. So fusions happen when representations are similar. They inhibit each other to the degree that they're different, but they also join together. They fuse to the extent that they're similar.
So like blue and red mixing to make purple.
Exactly. But complications happen when representations are from different continua, like a color and a sound. And if there aren't other representations around to interfere, they can actually unite completely, form a single, more complex mental force. He calls this a complete complication. But in reality, it's more common to have incomplete complications, where there's some mutual inhibition going on within each continuum, which prevents those representations from totally uniting. But even then, he says, those inhibited representations can sometimes team up and form a total force, which helps them to resist further inhibition.
Okay, so it's a very dynamic system, these representations constantly merging, inhibiting, fusing, forming alliances. And this brings us to the mechanics of spirit, which, as opposed to psychostatics, focuses on the process of those representations actually moving towards equilibrium. So it's like the difference between a snapshot and a video.
Exactly. And motion, in this context, it refers to the dimming or brightening of a representation as it's inhibited or supported by other representations. So it's the change in intensity over time. And this is where it gets a little confusing because he talks about the inhibition sum decreasing or falling during this process. But remember, the inhibition sum is defined as the total opposing force at equilibrium. So how can it be decreasing?
Yeah, that's a bit of a head scratcher.
Well, the key is to distinguish between the inhibition sum as a distributed load at equilibrium and the active forces of opposition that are at work while this system is moving towards equilibrium. So at the initial moment when representations collide, those active forces are super strong, but they haven't settled into that final distribution yet. As they start to inhibit each other, those active forces gradually decrease, and so the rate of inhibition slows down until you eventually reach equilibrium.
And this process of moving towards equilibrium, it never actually reaches complete stasis, does it?
Right. That's what his mathematical equation for psychic motion shows. It's a gradual, asymptotic approach towards the final inhibition sum. But it never actually gets there in a finite amount of time. So the mind is always in this state of gentle flux, a kind of constant peace. And there's also this interesting point he makes about the clarity of representations. At the moment of collision, when the inhibitory forces are at their peak, the representations are actually least clear in consciousness. And it's as those forces lessen that the representations start to rise again, to become more distinct, even though their overall intensity might be lower.
Now, what happens to representations when they get pushed below the lineman? They don't just disappear, do they?
No, they don't. Remember, they're tied to the soul's self-preservation, so they have this tendency to persist. And he talks about two ways they can come back into consciousness: immediate reproduction and mediate reproduction.
Okay, walk me through those.
So immediate reproduction is when a representation pops back up because whatever was inhibiting it is gone. Like you suddenly remember a name when you see the person's face.
Or, you walk past a certain place and all these memories come flooding back.
Exactly. But mediate reproduction is when a representation needs help from other representations that are associated with it. They kind of pull each other back up to consciousness.
So it's like they have a network of friends that can help them out.
Exactly. And a Herbart sees these two types of reproduction as the basis for memory and recollection.
And he also talks about representational series, right? These sequences of thoughts that unfold in our minds. And mediate reproduction plays a big role in that as well.
Right. He says if you have a series of representations, let's call them A, B, C, and they get pushed below the lineman, then even if just one of them, like B, comes back into consciousness, it can bring the others with it.
Well, yeah.
A chain reaction.
Yeah.
And he talks about the evolution of a series where A comes back first, then B, then C, and so on. And also involution, where it starts from somewhere in the middle, like B, and then spreads out in both directions.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about representations, their interactions, how they form our perceptions of space and time. But what about feelings and desires? Where do those fit into this whole system? Because Herbart was very insistent that his psychology could account for the whole range of human experience, not just the purely cognitive stuff.
He was. And this is where his concepts of Geist and Gemüt come in. Geist is often translated as mind or spirit, and it refers to the soul as this representing activity. And Gemüt is often translated as disposition or temperament, and it refers to the feeling and desiring aspect of the mind. And he was aware that some people might criticize his approach as being too focused on the quantifiable aspects of mind, the mechanics of representations, and neglecting the qualitative aspects, the feelings and desires.
Like he's trying to reduce the richness of human experience to a bunch of equations?
Right. But Herbart argued that Gemüt is not a separate faculty. It's not something distinct from Geist. He says that feeling and desire are actually states of representations. They're ways that representations are experienced or modified.
So feeling and desire aren't separate things. They're like properties of representations.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He says when we have a feeling, it's always connected to a represented object or situation. And when we desire something, we're always representing that thing that we desire. And he explains things like emotional dispositions, like being generally cheerful or melancholic in terms of patterns of representations that persist over time. And he has a very interesting explanation of unpleasant feelings. He says they arise from this kind of compression that happens when a representation gets squeezed between other representations that are both supporting it and inhibiting it at the same time.
It's like being mentally stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Yeah, exactly. And he defines feelings more formally as these specific modifications of consciousness that go beyond mere representing. They arise from the way a representation is being pushed and pulled by other representations. Desire, on the other hand, is the consciousness of a representation striving, its effort to become clearer and more dominant in consciousness. And he even extends this framework to more intense states like affects and passions, viewing them as the strongest expressions of feeling and desire, and explaining them in terms of large, fused representational masses being temporarily pushed beyond their equilibrium point. And these intense states are usually transient because representations always want to return to balance.
Okay, so we have this complex interplay of representations, and feelings and desires are like different flavors or colors that those representations can take on. And it's all happening within this non-spatial, non-temporal soul. But how does Herbart account for our experience of space and time, which are such fundamental aspects of our perception?
Well, he was primarily interested in how we develop these perceptions, how children come to experience the world as spatial and temporal. He didn't see space and time as these innate a priori categories like Kant did. He thought they were acquired through experience.
So a child has to learn what left and right mean, what before and after mean, through interacting with the world.
Exactly. And he was very much against the idea of space and time as being inherent properties of the mind itself. But the big challenge for him was to explain how these spatial and temporal differences that we perceive could be represented by a mind that is, at its core, non-spatial and non-temporal. How do you get extension from something that's not extended?
Right, that's a tough one.
It is. But he had a very clever solution. He said it's all about the way representations are connected, the patterns of association and reproduction. He talked about these multidimensional representational series or cross series that are constantly forming and dissolving in our minds. And he argued that the subtle gradations and the strength of those connections, the gradation and the representations connection, as he called it, correspond to the way we experience things as being spatially or temporally ordered.
So the differences in the strength of those connections, the way they kind of fade and brighten over time, that's what creates the feeling of things being next to each other in space or happening one after the other in time.
Exactly. He paints this picture of countless representations generated by our senses, constantly fusing and forming these complex interwoven patterns. It's like a tapestry that's constantly being woven and rewoven. And he uses the example of eye movements, how when we move our eyes across an object, we're actually triggering the reproduction of all the different representations that make up that object. And the order in which they reappear is what creates our perception of spatial extension. And he says time perception works similarly. It's the reproduction of these interwoven representations, but unfolding over time.
Okay, so space and time are basically emergent properties of the way representations are organized.
Right.
Now, all this talk of representations and their interactions, it might seem like we're just talking about basic perception and sensory experience. But Herbart was very interested in how we go from those basic building blocks to more complex thought, to abstract concepts, to judgments and reasoning.
He was. And he makes this interesting point that we don't actually experience abstract space or time. We experience things in space and events in time. And he says this is because of the fundamental unity of the psyche. All these complex representations have to be built up from simple sensations. And if there were no inhibition, no opposition between those sensations, then all our representations would just collapse into a single, undifferentiated experience. It's the interplay of those forces that allows us to experience the world as this multitude of distinct objects and events.
So in a way, the diversity of our experience is actually a product of the limitations of our consciousness. It's because we can't hold everything in mind at once that we can perceive individual things.
Exactly. And then the question becomes, how do we go from these individual sensory representations to more abstract concepts, to general ideas? And he was very critical of that traditional idea of the mind having this innate power of understanding that can somehow synthesize all this sensory data into coherent objects.
So no Kantian categories or anything like that.
No. Instead, he proposes what he calls a passive synthesis, where representations just kind of spontaneously connect with each other based on the laws of psychomechanics and psychostatics.
So the mind organizes itself without needing some external organizing principle.
Right. And he also makes this very important distinction between the psychological concept and the logical concept. The logical concept is like the abstract, shared meaning of a word. It exists out there in the world of concepts.
Like the dictionary definition.
Yeah, kind of. But the psychological concept is the actual representation that exists in a particular person's mind. And psychology, for Herbart, is about studying how those psychological concepts are formed.
So how do we go from experiencing individual things to having abstract ideas about them?
Well, he says concepts aren't innate. They're developed through experience, through the soul's self-preservation. It starts with a sensation or perception entering consciousness. Then it gets inhibited, and then it can return as an image, and eventually, through connections with other representations, it can become a memory. And he says we arrive at the logical concept by abstracting away from the particularities of our own experience, by reflecting on the fact that certain representations keep popping up, keep coming back. And he describes the process of forming these psychological concepts in 3 stages: isolation, analysis through judgments, and classification.
Okay, break this down for me.
So isolation is where you have multiple representational series that share some similarities, and those similar elements kind of fuse together, while the dissimilar elements get pushed aside.
Yeah.
And this creates a crude concept, a kind of rough draft of the idea.
And he uses the example of seeing the same person in different contexts, right? You start to form a general idea of that person, even though you've never seen them exactly the same way twice.
Exactly. And he says general concepts, like the concept of tree, are formed the same way, through this fusion of similar experiences. And then the next stage is analysis through judgments, where we start to make more explicit connections between representations. He says that when a new sensation enters consciousness, it can be assimilated to an older representation, and this act of assimilation can be seen as a kind of primitive judgment.
So like this red thing I'm seeing, it's similar to that other red thing I saw before, so it must be an apple.
Right. And then when this fusion process gets interrupted for some reason, we get a more explicit separation between subject and predicate, and that's what we experience as a logical judgment. It's like the representation of the new sensation, the subject, gets to hang out in consciousness by itself for a bit before the predicate comes along and connects with it.
Okay, so it's all about the timing, the sequence of those representations.
It is.